in the dead of winter, 1847. The mountains of Vermont were a place where hope froze as quickly as water in a bucket left by the door. The town of Milbrook, nestled in a narrow valley between the Green Mountains, was a community that had learned to survive on little more than grit, faith, and the stubbornness of its people. That February, a blizzard swept through Windham County, swallowing roads, barns, and even entire families. 17 souls were lost to the storm, their bodies never recovered, their names etched into the memory of a town that already knew too much about loss. It was on one of those nights, when the wind howled like a living thing and the snow piled higher than the windowsills, that a stranger appeared at the edge of Milbrook. He called himself Samuel Hawthorne, though no one in Vermont or anywhere else could find a trace of that name in any record before that night. He emerged from the whiteout, walking upright against a wind that bent trees to the ground, his coat and boots unlike anything the townsfolk had ever seen. Some said he looked like a man who had walked out of another world, or perhaps another time. The people of Milbrook were wary, but they were also desperate. Their doctor, Ezekiel Putnam, was running out of medicine and hope. The last supply wagon had arrived before the first snows, and the town's food stores were dwindling. Children coughed through the night, and the old and frail were dying in their beds. When Samuel Hawthorne arrived, he brought with him a satchel of strange medicines and a knowledge of healing that seemed to border on the miraculous. Within days, he had cured fevers that had baffled Dr. Putnam, and his remedies worked with a speed and efficiency that defied explanation. But there was something about Hawthorne that unsettled even the most grateful of his patients. He spoke of distant lands beyond the mountains, of valleys where the sun shone differently and the old ways still held sway. His accent was impossible to place, part English, part something older, with words that seemed to slip in and out of memory like half-remembered dreams. He watched people with a pale, unblinking gaze, as if he were measuring them for some purpose they could not guess. Children were drawn to him, fascinated by his stories of survival and the strange tools he carried. Adults, on the other hand, found themselves keeping their distance, unable to shake the feeling that Hawthorne was cataloging everything he saw. The winter fever that had threatened to wipe out half the town began to recede, and for a time, Milbrook dared to hope. But as the snow melted and the days grew longer, questions began to surface. Where had Hawthorne come from? How had he survived the blizzard that had killed so many? Why did his medicines work so well, and what exactly was in them? Dr. Putnam, a man of science and reason, started to keep a journal of his observations, noting the subtle changes in the behavior of those who had been treated by Hawthorne. They grew stronger, yes, but also more restless, more protective of their food, more prone to strange dreams and sudden hungers. The Milbrook Historical Society has kept the records of that winter locked away for over a century and a half. Diaries, letters, and medical notes that tell a story too disturbing for most to accept. They reveal not just who Samuel Hawthorne was, but what he did to survive in those frozen peaks and what he continued to do long after the snow had melted. The truth about Samuel Hawthorne is not just a tale of survival gone wrong. It is a warning about how quickly civilization can unravel, and how monsters can hide behind the faces of those we trust most. Before we continue with the story of Samuel Hawthorne and the winter that changed Milbrook forever, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Stories like this one dig deep into America's darkest historical secrets, and you might be surprised how many similar disappearances happened in your own state during those harsh winters of the 1840s. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from, and prepare yourself for a history that will make you question what it means to be human. Milbrook, Vermont, in the winter of 1847, was a place where the line between survival and surrender was measured in inches of snow and ounces of hope. The town's 300 souls had learned to endure the long, dark months with a mixture of stubbornness and faith, but that year, The cold seemed to seep deeper into the bones of the land and its people. The blizzard that brought Samuel Hawthorne to their door had already claimed 17 lives across Windham County, and the survivors were left to count their losses in silence. The arrival of Hawthorne was as much an event as the storm itself. He appeared at the edge of town just as the wind began to die, a tall figure moving with a purpose that defied the chaos of the elements. His coat, made from some thick, weatherproof hide, was unlike anything the townsfolk had seen, and his boots left strange, deep tracks in the snow patterns that Dr. Putnam would later sketch in his journal, noting their odd, almost geometric design. Hawthorne's face was sharp and angular, his eyes a pale blue that seemed to reflect the winter sky, and his hair, though dark, was streaked with white in a way that made it impossible to guess his age. He introduced himself simply as Samuel Hawthorne, a traveler from beyond the peaks, and offered no further explanation. The townspeople, wary but desperate, welcomed him into the warmth of the Milbrook Inn, where Abigail Forrest, the widowed innkeeper, poured him a mug of strong coffee and watched as he thawed by the fire. The room fell silent as he removed his satchel, a bag made from the same strange material as his coat, and began to unpack its contents. Vials of dark liquid, bundles of dried herbs, and tools that looked more suited to a surgeon than a mountain wanderer. It was young Sarah Thornberry's cough that first drew Hawthorne's attention. The girl, only 12, had been growing weaker by the day, her breathing ragged and her fever unbroken. Dr. Putnam had done all he could, but his supplies were nearly gone, and he feared the worst. Hawthorne listened to Sarah's chest, examined her eyes, and then produced a small vial from his satchel. He instructed Grace Thornberry, Sarah's mother, to mix 3 drops with warm water and give it to the girl before bed. By morning, Sarah's cough had subsided and her fever had broken. Word of the miraculous recovery spread quickly, and soon half the town was lined up outside the inn, seeking Hawthorne's help for ailments that had plagued them all winter. He treated each patient with the same calm efficiency, diagnosing illnesses with a glance and prescribing remedies that worked with uncanny speed. Dr. Putnam, at first skeptical, found himself both impressed and unsettled by the stranger's knowledge. Hawthorne's methods were unlike anything he had learned in Boston or seen in his years of practice. He seemed to know exactly which herbs to gather, even in the dead of winter, and his medicines worked when nothing else would. But as the days passed, the town began to notice other things about Samuel Hawthorne. He never slept more than a few hours at a time, and often disappeared into the woods during the worst storms, returning with fresh meat and rare plants that no one else could find. His boots were never wet, and his coat seemed impervious to the snow. Children were drawn to him, fascinated by his stories of distant lands and old ways. But adults found themselves uneasy in his presence. There was something in the way he watched people, as if he were memorizing their faces, their habits, their weaknesses. Dr. Putnam began to keep a separate journal, documenting not just Hawthorne's cures, but the subtle changes he observed in his patients. Those treated by Hawthorne grew stronger, yes, but also more restless, more protective of their food, more prone to strange dreams and sudden hungers. The town, once united by hardship, began to fracture along invisible lines, as if some new force was working its way into the heart of Milbrook. And all the while, Samuel Hawthorne watched and waited. The days after Samuel Hawthorne's arrival passed in a blur of snow and whispered rumors. The townspeople, grateful for his healing, began to rely on him for more than just medicine. He fixed broken tools with a craftsman's touch, showed the men how to reinforce their barns against the wind, and taught the children games that no one in Milbrook had ever seen before. Yet, for all his helpfulness, there was a distance in Hawthorne, a sense that he was always observing, always calculating, as if he were a guest in a world that was not quite his own. Dr. Putnam, whose skepticism had not faded, watched Hawthorne closely. He noted the way the stranger's eyes lingered on the weakest members of the community. the way he seemed to know who would fall ill before the first symptoms appeared. Putnam's medical supplies were nearly gone, and he found himself reluctantly turning to Hawthorne for help. Each time, Hawthorne produced a remedy from his satchel, and each time, the patient recovered. But Putnam could not shake the feeling that the cures came at a cost he did not yet understand. Grace Thornberry, too, began to notice changes in her family. Sarah, once a quiet and obedient child, grew restless and irritable, demanding more food and waking in the night from vivid dreams. Mary, her younger sister, became withdrawn, spending hours staring out the window at the snow. Even Thomas, Grace's husband, seemed changed quicker to anger, more protective of the family's dwindling supplies. Grace confided her worries to Abigail Foresque, who admitted that she, too, had noticed strange behavior among her guests at the inn. The town's sense of unease deepened when a supply wagon failed to arrive from Bennington. The roads were impassable, and the townspeople began to fear that they would not survive until spring. Hawthorne, however, remained calm. He assured the town that he could provide what they needed, and over the next week, he led small groups into the woods to gather food and firewood. Each time, they returned with more than they had expected: fresh meat, wild herbs, even fish from streams that should have been frozen solid. But the bounty came with a price. The hunters who accompanied Hawthorne returned changed. They spoke less, ate more, and began to distance themselves from the rest of the community. Dr. Putnam recorded in his journal that several of the men developed a craving for raw meat, and that their dreams were filled with images of snow and blood. The town's children began to play new games, chasing each other through the snow and pretending to hunt. Their laughter edged with something wild and unfamiliar. One night, Grace Thornberry awoke to find Sarah standing at the foot of her bed, her eyes wide and unblinking. "He says we have to be strong, Mama," Sarah whispered. "He says the old ways are coming back." Grace pulled her daughter into bed and held her close. But Sarah's body was cold, and she shivered even under the heavy quilts as winter dragged on. The town's isolation grew more complete. Letters sent to neighboring towns went unanswered, and the few travelers who passed through Milbrook left quickly, unsettled by the atmosphere of suspicion and fear. The church, once the heart of the community, stood empty most Sundays, and Reverend Greenfield's sermons grew darker, filled with warnings about the dangers of pride and the need for repentance. Through it all, Samuel Hawthorne remained a constant presence, helpful, knowledgeable, and always just a little apart. He spent long hours walking the perimeter of the town, studying the mountains and the sky, as if searching for something only he could see. The townspeople, torn between gratitude and fear, began to wonder if they had invited something into their midst that they could not control. And in the darkness of the long winter nights, the people of Milbrook dreamed of snow and hunger, and eyes that watched from the shadows. As February deepened, the blizzard's grip on Milbrook only tightened. The snowdrifts grew higher, and the wind howled through the eaves like a warning. The townspeople, once so quick to gather for news or comfort, now kept to their homes, peering out at the world with suspicion. It was as if the storm had not only buried the roads, but also the trust that had once bound the community together. Samuel Hawthorne, meanwhile, became more indispensable with each passing day. He moved from house to house, tending the sick, repairing broken tools, and offering advice on how to stretch dwindling supplies. His presence was both a comfort and a source of unease. He seemed to know things before they happened: who would fall ill, which animal would die, when the next storm would hit. Some whispered that he could read minds, or that he had brought the blizzard with him from whatever world he had come. Dr. Putnam's journal entries grew more frantic. He wrote of patients who recovered from fever only to develop strange new symptoms: insatiable hunger, vivid nightmares, and a growing detachment from their families. He noted that those who spent the most time with Hawthorne seemed to change the fastest. Their eyes grew distant, their tempers short, and their appetite, especially for meat, became almost feral. One evening, Jeremiah Prescott, the town's merchant, invited a few trusted neighbors to his store after dark. They spoke in hushed tones about the changes they had seen in their families and themselves. Prescott produced a ledger, showing a pattern of missing supplies and unexplained disappearances. "It's as if something is eating away at us from the inside," he said, his voice trembling. "And I don't just mean the hunger." The group agreed to keep watch on Hawthorne, hoping to learn more about his origins and intentions. They took turns following him on his nightly walks, but he always seemed to know when he was being watched. He would vanish into the woods, only to reappear hours later, his boots clean and his satchel full. Once, Timothy Prescott, Jeremiah's teenage son, swore he saw Hawthorne speaking to someone in the trees, a tall, shadowy figure that melted into the darkness when approached. Meanwhile, Grace Thornberry's fears for her children grew. Sarah's dreams became more disturbing, filled with images of endless snow and voices calling her to join a feast in the woods. Mary, once cheerful and curious, now spent her days staring at the fire, refusing to eat anything but the meat Hawthorne provided. Even Thomas, a man of few words, began to mutter in his sleep, his hands twitching as if grasping for something just out of reach. The town's sense of isolation was complete when a traveler from Bennington arrived, seeking shelter from the storm. He was gaunt and exhausted, his horse nearly dead from the cold. The townspeople welcomed him, eager for news from the outside world. But when he heard the name Samuel Hawthorne, the traveler's face went pale. He claimed to have seen a man by that name in another town, years before, during another harsh winter. "He saved lives, yes," the traveler whispered, "but when the snow melted, there were people missing, families gone, and no one ever found out what happened to them." The warning sent a chill through the room, but by then, it was too late. Hawthorne's influence had already taken root in Milbrook, and the town was changing in ways no one could have imagined. The blizzard outside was nothing compared to the storm brewing within. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, the people of Milbrook clung to what little hope they had left, even as they began to realize that the true danger might not be the winter, but the man they had welcomed into their midst. The blizzard finally broke in early March, but the relief that swept through Milbrook was short-lived. The snowdrifts receded, revealing a landscape scarred by Lowe's collapsed barns, frozen livestock, and the graves of those who hadn't survived the long winter. Yet, the greatest change was not in the land, but in the people themselves. The town's children, once playful and bright, now moved with a wary animal caution. Adults spoke less, their eyes darting to the shadows, as if expecting something to emerge from the woods at any moment. Samuel Hawthorne's role in the community had shifted. No longer just a healer, he had become a kind of leader, one whose authority was accepted without question. He organized hunting parties, taught the townspeople how to trap and preserve meat, and led expeditions into the forest that always returned with more food than anyone thought possible. The townsfolk, desperate to survive, followed his instructions, with a devotion that bordered on worship. But Dr. Putnam and Jeremiah Prescott remained uneasy. They met in secret, comparing notes and sharing their growing suspicions. Putnam had begun to analyze the medicines Hawthorne provided, using what little equipment he had left. He found traces of substances he couldn't identify, powders and tinctures that seemed to affect not just the body, but the mind. Prescott, meanwhile, had started to track the disappearances that had plagued the region for years. He found a pattern. Wherever Hawthorne went, people vanished. Sometimes whole families, sometimes just a single traveler, but always without a trace. One afternoon, Timothy Prescott made a discovery that would change everything. Exploring the woods behind the Thornberry farm, he stumbled upon a hidden cassia cave lined with animal hides and filled with bundles of clothing, jewelry, and personal effects. Some of the items belonged to people who had disappeared that winter. Others were older, from families who had vanished years before. Most disturbing were the sketches Timothy found, wrapped in oiled cloth, anatomical drawings of humans and animals, marked with notations about butchery and preservation. When Timothy showed his father what he had found, Jeremiah's worst fears were confirmed. He brought the evidence to Dr. Putnham, who recognized the handwriting in the journal as Hawthorne's. The entries described a systematic process of hunting, killing, and processing human beings for food and medicine. The author wrote with clinical detachment, detailing how to break down psychological resistance to cannibalism, how to introduce human flesh into the diet without arousing suspicion, and how to create a community of willing accomplices. The two men realized they were facing something far more dangerous than a simple murderer. Hawthorne was a master manipulator, a man who had perfected the art of survival by turning entire communities into instruments of his will. He had done it before, in other towns, and he was doing it again in Milbrook. But how could they convince the others? Hawthorne had saved lives, cured the sick, and kept the town from starving. To accuse him of such monstrous crimes would be unthinkably. They had undeniable proof. Dr. Putnam decided to confront Hawthorne directly, hoping to catch him off guard. He asked about the medicines, the disappearances, the strange dreams that plagued the town. Hawthorne listened with his usual calm, then smiled. "Survival," he said, "requires sacrifices that the civilized mind cannot accept. But when the world turns cold, the old ways return." That night, Dr. Putnam wrote in his journal, "We have invited a wolf into our fold, and now we must decide whether to fight or to follow." As the thaw began, and the first green shoots appeared in the fields, the people of Milbrook faced a choice that would define their future and reveal just how thin the line between civilization and savagery truly is. The first signs of spring brought no comfort to Milbrook. The snow melted, but the air remained heavy with suspicion and dread. The townspeople, once eager to greet the change of season, now eyed each other with a wariness that bordered on fear. The children's games grew stranger. Mock hunts and rituals played out in the muddy streets, their laughter edged with something wild. The adults, too, seemed changed, their conversations clipped and guarded, as if every word might be overheard by someone who would use it against them. Samuel Hawthorne's influence was everywhere. He had become the town's unspoken authority, his word carrying more weight than the minister's sermons or the doctor's advice. He led the first planting of the year, instructing the farmers on new methods for preserving seeds and protecting crops from late frosts. He organized the rebuilding of barns and fences, his knowledge of construction and survival seemingly endless. Yet, for all his helpfulness, there was a growing sense that Hawthorne was not just guiding the town, he was shaping it, molding it into something new. Dr. Putnam and Jeremiah Prescott continued their investigation in secret. They met late at night, poring over Hawthorne's journal and the evidence Timothy had found in the woods. The more they read, the more they realized the depth of Hawthorne's manipulation. He had not only introduced new medicines and techniques, he had systematically broken down the town's resistance to his philosophy. The dreams, the cravings, the changes in behavior were all part of a deliberate process, designed to make the unthinkable seem necessary. The two men decided to share their findings with a small group of trusted townspeople, Reverend Greenfield, Abigail Foresk, and Thomas Thornberry. They gathered in the back room of the general store, the air thick with fear and disbelief. Prescott laid out the evidence of the journal, the sketches, the personal effects from the cave. Dr. Putnam explained the chemical analysis of Hawthorne's medicines, the psychological conditioning, the pattern of disappearances. At first, the group was reluctant to believe Hawthorne had saved their lives, after all, but as the evidence mounted, denial gave way to horror. Reverend Greenfield, his faith shaken, spoke for them all. "We have allowed ourselves to be led astray by a man who wears the mask of a savior, but is in truth a destroyer." The group resolved to act, but they knew they had to be careful. Hawthorne was always watching, always listening. They decided to gather more evidence, to document the changes in the town, and to find a way to expose Hawthorne without putting themselves or their families at risk. Meanwhile, Hawthorne seemed to sense the growing resistance. He became more guarded, his instructions more insistent. He began to speak openly of the old ways, of the need to abandon the weaknesses of civilization and embrace the harsh realities of survival. He told stories of his homeland, where communities thrived by accepting the necessity of sacrifice, where the strong protected the weak by consuming what could not survive. The town was divided. Some, especially those who had benefited most from Hawthorne's cures, defended him fiercely. Others, haunted by dreams and memories they could not explain, began to question his motives. The tension grew with each passing day, the sense of impending crisis as palpable as the first rumble of thunder before a storm. As the days lengthened and the fields turned green, Milbrook stood on the brink of a decision that would determine not only its survival, but its very soul. The line between neighbor and enemy, between human and monster, had never been so thin. The conspiracy to expose Samuel Hawthorne grew in secret, but so did the risks. Dr. Putnam, Jeremiah Prescott, Reverend Greenfield, Abigail Forrest, and Thomas Thornberry met under the cover of darkness, their meetings growing more urgent as Hawthorne's grip on the town tightened. They documented everything, the changes in the townspeople's behavior, the strange rituals that had begun to appear in daily life, and the subtle but unmistakable signs that Hawthorne was preparing for something larger. Grace Thornberry, who had once welcomed Hawthorne into her home, now watched him with a mother's suspicion. She noticed how her children, especially Sarah and Mary, clung to his every word, how they mimicked his mannerisms and repeated his stories as if they were gospel. She found drawings under Sarah's pillow, sketches of feasts in the snow, of people gathered around fires, their faces twisted in hunger and joy. Mary, once afraid of the dark, now wandered the house at night, whispering to herself in a language Grace did not recognize. The group's greatest fear was that Hawthorne had already converted too many of the townspeople to his way of thinking. The hunters who had accompanied him into the woods were now his most loyal followers, their eyes cold and distant, their loyalty to the community replaced by a fierce devotion to Hawthorne. They spoke of him as a prophet, a man sent by fate to save Milbrook from the weakness of the outside world. Dr. Putnam's medical practice became a front for the resistance. He used his house as a safe meeting place, treating those who still resisted Hawthorne's influence and gathering information from those who had begun to question the changes in their families. He kept detailed notes, recording the spread of the psychological conditioning and the increasing number of disappearances. He realized that Hawthorne's methods were not just about survival, they were about control, about creating a community that would follow him without question. One night, Timothy Prescott returned from the woods with news that chilled the group to the bone. He had found another cache, deeper in the mountains, filled with supplies, weapons, and more journals. The entries described plans for expanding Hawthorne's influence beyond Milbrook, for creating a network of communities bound by the same philosophy of survival at any cost. The journals spoke of the council and the directors, shadowy figures who guided Hawthorne's actions and provided him with resources and instructions. The group realized that they were not just fighting for Milbrook, they were fighting to prevent the spread of a philosophy that could destroy countless other communities. They decided to act before Hawthorne could implement his final plan. Reverend Greenfield, whose faith had been shaken but not broken, called for a town meeting, hoping to rally the unconverted and expose Hawthorne's true nature. The meeting was tense from the start. Hawthorne arrived with his followers, their faces set in grim determination. The townspeople, divided and afraid, listened as Reverend Greenfield laid out the evidence, the disappearances, the journals, the changes in behavior, and the proof of cannibalism. Hawthorne listened in silence, his pale eyes scanning the crowd, measuring the strength of his opposition. When the accusations were finished, Hawthorne stood and addressed the town. He did not deny the charges. Instead, he spoke of the harsh realities of survival, of the need to abandon the illusions of civilization and embrace the truth of the world. He promised strength, unity, and a future free from fear and want. His words were powerful, and many in the crowd found themselves swayed by his conviction. When the accusations were finished, Hawthorne stood and addressed the town. He did not deny the charges. Instead, he spoke of the harsh realities of survival, of the need to abandon the illusions of civilization and embrace the truth of the world. He promised strength, unity, and a future free from fear and want. His words were powerful, and many in the crowd found themselves swayed by his conviction. The meeting ended in chaos. The town split between those who saw Hawthorne as a savior and those who saw him as a monster. The resistance knew that the time for secrecy was over. They would have to act, and soon, if they hoped to save what remained of Milbrook's soul. The days after the town meeting were marked by a tension so thick it seemed to settle over Milbrook like a second winter. Neighbors who had once shared bread and laughter now crossed the street to avoid each other. The children, once united in their games, split into two camps: those who followed Hawthorne's teachings and those who clung to the old ways, their play turning into mock battles that mirrored the growing rift among the adults. Samuel Hawthorne moved through the town with a calm that was almost chilling. He spoke to his followers in quiet, measured tones, reinforcing the necessity of sacrifice and the strength found in unity. He reminded them of the hunger and death that had haunted Milbrook before his arrival, and promised that, under his guidance, they would never know such suffering again. His charisma was undeniable, and for many, the memory of his miraculous cures and the food he had provided outweighed the dark rumors swirling around him. Dr. Putnam and the resistance worked feverishly to gather more evidence. They documented the changes in the townspeople, the missing travelers, and the caches of supplies hidden in the mountains. Abigail Forrest risked her safety to question the women of the town, learning that several had found strange objects: bones, teeth, and scraps of unfamiliar fabric hidden in their homes. Reverend Greenfield, his faith now a weapon rather than a comfort, began to preach openly against Hawthorne, warning of the dangers of false prophets and the seduction of easy answers. But Hawthorne was prepared. He countered every accusation with logic and charm, turning the town's fears against the resistance. He accused Dr. Putnam and Prescott of jealousy and pride, claiming they resented his success and sought to undermine the unity he had brought to Milbrook. He reminded the townspeople of the suffering they had endured before his arrival, and painted the resistance as agents of chaos who would return them to hunger and despair. The town became a battleground of whispers and glances, of secret meetings and coded messages. Families were divided, friendships shattered, and the sense of community that had once defined Milbrook was replaced by suspicion and fear. The resistance knew that time was running out. Hawthorne's influence was growing stronger, and the number of his followers increased with each passing day. One night, Timothy Prescott returned from another foray into the mountains with news that could not be ignored. He had found evidence that Hawthorne was planning a final ritual ceremony that would bind his followers to him forever, sealing their loyalty with an act so terrible that no one would ever be able to turn back. The journals spoke of a sacred feast, a night when the boundaries between the old world and the new would be erased, and the community would be reborn in Hawthorne's image. The resistance realized that they had only one chance left. They would have to confront Hawthorne directly, to expose his crimes and break his hold on the town before the ritual could take place. Dr. Putnam, Jeremiah Prescott, Reverend Greenfield, Abigail Forrest, and Thomas Thornberry met for what they knew might be the last time. Their resolve hardened by the knowledge that the fate of Milbrook and perhaps many other towns rested in their hands. As the night of the ritual approached, The air in Milbrook grew heavy with anticipation. The townspeople, divided and afraid, waited to see which vision of the future would prevail: the harsh, unyielding world of Samuel Hawthorne, or the fragile hope of a community struggling to remember what it meant to be human. The night chosen for Hawthorne's ritual arrived with a sky as black as pitch and a wind that rattled every shutter in Milbrook. The town seemed to hold its breath, the usual sounds of life replaced by an uneasy silence. Those loyal to Hawthorne gathered at the Thornberry house, drawn by whispered instructions and the promise of a new beginning. They came in twos and threes, faces hidden beneath scarves and hats, their eyes shining with a feverish anticipation that bordered on fanaticism. Inside, the house had been transformed. The furniture was pushed aside to make room for a circle of chairs around the dining table, which was draped in white linen and adorned with candles and strange symbols drawn in ash. At the center stood Samuel Hawthorne, his presence commanding, his voice low and hypnotic as he welcomed each follower by name. The children, including Sarah and Mary Thornberry, sat at his feet, their faces pale and expectant. Meanwhile, the resistance moved into position. Dr. Putnam, Jeremiah Prescott, Reverend Greenfield, Abigail Foresk, and Thomas Thornberry waited in the shadows outside, joined by a handful of townspeople who had resisted Hawthorne's influence. They carried lanterns, weapons, and the evidence they had gathered: journals, sketches, and the personal effects of the missing. Their plan was simple: interrupt the ritual, present the proof, and appeal to whatever remained of the townspeople's reason and decency as the ceremony began. Hawthorne spoke of survival and sacrifice, of the old ways that had kept his people alive through centuries of hardship. He described a world where the strong protected the weak by consuming what could not survive, where waste was the only sin, and where the bonds of community were forged in blood and necessity. His words wove a spell over the room, and even those who had doubted him felt their resolve begin to waver. At the appointed moment, Dr. Putnam and the others burst into the house, lanterns blazing and voices raised. They confronted Hawthorne with the evidence, reading aloud from his journals and displaying the grisly trophies found in the mountains. Reverend Greenfield called on the townspeople to remember their faith, their families, and the values that had once united them. Abigail pleaded with the women to protect their children, to see the truth behind Hawthorne's mask. For a moment, the spell was broken. Some of Hawthorne's followers faltered, their eyes filling with confusion and fear. But Hawthorne was ready. He turned the confrontation into a test of loyalty, demanding that his followers choose between him and the outsiders who would see them starve. He accused the resistance of plotting to destroy the community, of envying the strength and unity he had brought to Milbrook. The room erupted into chaos. Some followers rushed to Hawthorne's side, while others tried to flee. The children screamed, torn between parents and prophet. Fights broke out, and the house became a battleground of desperation and betrayal. In the confusion, Hawthorne slipped away, vanishing into the night with a handful of his most devoted followers. The resistance, battered but determined, managed to rescue several townspeople from the ritual, but the damage was done. The community was shattered, its trust broken beyond repair. As dawn broke over Milbrook, the survivors emerged into a world forever changed, haunted by the knowledge of what they had almost become and by the fear that Hawthorne was still out there, waiting for another chance to finish what he had started. The aftermath of the failed ritual left Milbrook in a state of shock. The Thornberry house, once a symbol of family and community, now stood as a grim reminder of how close the town had come to losing itself. The survivors wandered the muddy streets in silence, avoiding each other's eyes, each person wrestling with their own guilt and confusion. Some wept openly for the friends and family who had chosen to follow Hawthorne into the darkness. Others burned with anger at the deception that had nearly destroyed them all. Dr. Putnam and the resistance worked tirelessly to restore some semblance of order. They tended to the wounded, comforted the children, and tried to reassure those who had been caught in Hawthorne's spell. Reverend Greenfield led prayers for forgiveness and healing. His sermons now filled with humility and sorrow rather than fire and brimstone. Abigail Foresque opened the inn to those who had lost their homes or could not bear to return to the places where the rituals had taken place. But the scars ran deep. The children, especially, struggled to understand what had happened. Sarah and Mary Thornberry clung to their mother, waking from nightmares that left them screaming and inconsolable. They spoke of voices in the snow, of feasts in the woods, and of a hunger that would not go away. Grace Thornberry, racked with guilt for ever trusting Hawthorne, spent her days trying to undo the damage, but she knew that some wounds would never fully heal. The town's leaders met to decide what to do next. Some argued for leaving Milbrook behind, for scattering to other towns and starting over. Others insisted on staying, determined to rebuild and ensure that nothing like this could ever happen again. In the end, most chose to remain, bound together by the shared trauma and the hope that they could find redemption in the hard work of survival. Meanwhile, the search for Hawthorne and his followers began in earnest. Dr. Putnam, Jeremiah, Prescott, and a group of volunteers scoured the mountains. Following the trails to the hidden caches and campsites Hawthorne had prepared, they found evidence of hasty departures, abandoned supplies, half-burned journals, and the remains of rituals that made even the most hardened men shudder. But of Hawthorne himself, there was no sign. It was as if he had vanished into the wilderness, taking his secrets with him. As the weeks passed, rumors spread of strange sightings in the mountains, of a tall man with pale eyes, leading a band of followers through the snow, teaching them the old ways of survival. Some said they heard chanting at night, or saw fires burning in places where no one should have been. The fear that Hawthorne might return kept the town on edge, and every stranger who passed through was met with suspicion. Yet, even as the memory of Hawthorne's reign faded, the lessons he had taught lingered. The people of Milbrook became more self-reliant, more wary of outsiders, and more determined to protect their own. The old bonds of trust were slow to return, but in time, the town began to heal. The church was rebuilt, the fields were planted, and the children learned to laugh again, though never quite as freely as before. Dr. Putnam continued to document everything, his journals growing into a record of the town's ordeal and recovery. He wrote of the dangers of blind faith, the importance of questioning authority, and the resilience of the human spirit. He knew that Milbrook would never be the same, but he hoped that their story would serve as a warning to others, a reminder that evil can wear many faces, and that the line between savior and monster is often thinner than we care to admit. Spring in Milbrook was usually a time of renewal, but in 1847 it brought only a fragile sense of relief. The snow receded, revealing the scars of a town that had nearly been lost to darkness. The townspeople moved through their days with a new wariness, glancing over their shoulders and locking their doors at night. The laughter of children returned, but it was softer, tinged with the memory of nightmares that still lingered in the corners of their minds. Dr. Putnam became the town's anchor, his medical practice now as much about healing the mind as the body. He visited every home, checking on the children, listening to the fears of parents, and offering what comfort he could. He encouraged the townspeople to talk about what had happened, to share their stories and their pain. Some found solace in confession, while others could not bring themselves to speak of the rituals, the hunger, or the faces of those who had followed Hawthorne into the woods. Jeremiah Prescott took it upon himself to rebuild the community's trust. He organized work parties to repair damaged homes and barns, and he reopened the general store with a new policy of transparency. Every transaction recorded, every rumor investigated. He became a quiet leader, reminding the town that survival depended not just on strength, but on honesty and cooperation. Reverend Greenfield, humbled by his own failure to protect his flock, preached sermons of forgiveness and vigilance. He spoke of the dangers of pride and the need to question even those who seemed to offer salvation. His words resonated with a congregation that had learned the hard way that evil often comes disguised as hope. The children, especially those who had been closest to Hawthorne, struggled the most. Sarah and Mary Thornberry were haunted by dreams of snow and feasts, of voices calling them to join the old ways. Grace Thornberry, determined to save her daughters, spent hours reading to them, singing old hymns, and teaching them the stories of their ancestors. She watched for signs of relapse, strange cravings, secretive behavior, or the return of the vacant, predatory stare that had once marked Hawthorne's followers. As the weeks turned to months, the town slowly began to heal. The fields were planted, the livestock returned to the pastures, and the rhythms of daily life reasserted themselves. But the memory of Hawthorne's influence remained, a shadow that would never fully lift. The townspeople became more cautious, more skeptical of outsiders, and more determined to protect their community from any threat, no matter how well it was disguised. Rumors of Hawthorne's survival persisted. Hunters claimed to see his tracks in the mountains, and travelers spoke of a tall man with pale eyes who offered help to those in need, always during the harshest winters, always in places where people were desperate enough to accept any offer of salvation. Dr. Putnham recorded these stories in his journal, warning that Hawthorne's philosophy of survival at any cost was a contagion that could spread to any community. Given the right conditions, the lesson of Milbrook was clear: civilization is fragile, and the line between savior and monster is easily crossed. The town's ordeal became a cautionary tale, passed down through generations as a reminder that true strength lies not in the abandonment of morality, but in the courage to hold fast to it even when the world turns cold. As the years passed, the story of Samuel Hawthorne became a whispered legend in Milbrook and the surrounding valleys. Parents warned their children not to stray too far into the woods, and travelers who arrived during winter were met with suspicion and a wary hospitality. The town's elders, those who had survived the blizzard and the ordeal that followed, grew old with the knowledge that they had come perilously close to losing their humanity. Dr. Putnam's journals became a secret history, read only by a trusted few. He continued to document the lingering effects of Hawthorne's influence, the recurring nightmares, the occasional disappearances, and the subtle changes in the town's culture. He noted that, while most of the townspeople had returned to their old ways, a few remained marked by the experience, quieter, more withdrawn, and prone to sudden fits of anger or melancholy. Some left Milbrook altogether, seeking a fresh start in distant cities or on the western frontier. Jeremiah Prescott, ever the pragmatist, focused on rebuilding the town's economy and reputation. He encouraged trade with neighboring communities, hoping to restore Milbrook's place in the region and to dilute the memory of what had happened. He also kept a careful watch for any signs that Hawthorne or someone like him might return. Prescott's vigilance became a model for the next generation, who learned to balance kindness with caution. Reverend Greenfield, changed by the ordeal, became a more compassionate and humble leader. He opened the church to all, regardless of their past, and worked to heal the divisions that had nearly destroyed the town. His sermons, once stern and unyielding, now spoke of forgiveness, resilience, and the importance of questioning authority. He reminded his congregation that evil often comes in the guise of good, and that true faith requires both courage and discernment. The children who had survived Hawthorne's teachings grew into adults with a deep sense of responsibility. Sarah and Mary Thornberry, though forever changed by their experiences, became teachers and caretakers, dedicating their lives to protecting the vulnerable and ensuring that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. They taught their own children the value of community, the dangers of blind obedience, and the necessity of standing up to those who would exploit fear and desperation. Rumors of Hawthorne's continued existence persisted for decades. Stories circulated of a pale-eyed stranger appearing in remote towns during times of crisis. offering miraculous cures and survival advice. In each case, the pattern was the same: initial gratitude, followed by strange changes in behavior, and finally, a series of disappearances or unexplained deaths. Dr. Putnam, until his death, collected these accounts, convinced that Hawthorne, his philosophy was still at work in the world. Milbrook, though scarred, endured. The town's ordeal became a lesson passed down through generations, that survival is not enough if it comes at the cost of one's soul, and that the true test of a community is not how it endures hardship, but how it resists the temptation to become the very thing it fears. By the 1850s, Milbrook had become a town defined as much by what it remembered as by what it tried to forget. The children who had survived Hawthorne's winter were now adults, raising families of their own, and the story of the stranger from beyond the peaks was told in hushed voices around kitchen tables and campfires. Some details grew exaggerated with each retelling, but the core of the tale remained unchanged. A man had come in a time of need, and the price of his help had nearly been the town's soul. Dr. Putnam's journals, now kept in a locked chest beneath the floorboards of his study, became a source of both comfort and dread. He continued to record the subtle aftershocks of Hawthorne's influence, strange dreams, unexplained cravings, and the occasional disappearance that could not be easily explained. He noted that, while most of the townspeople had returned to their old routines, a few remained haunted by the past. Some left Milbrook, unable to bear the memories. Others stayed, determined to ensure that nothing like Hawthorne's reign would ever happen again. Jeremiah Prescott's general store became the unofficial center of the town's recovery. He kept meticulous records, not just of goods and transactions, but of the comings and goings of every resident and visitor. Prescott's vigilance, once seen as paranoia, was now respected as wisdom. He encouraged the townspeople to look out for one another, to question strangers, and to trust their instincts when something felt wrong. Reverend Greenfield's sermons shifted from warnings of damnation to messages of hope and resilience. He spoke of the importance of forgiveness, not just for others, but for oneself. He reminded his congregation that evil thrives in silence and secrecy, and that the only way to defeat it is through honesty and community. The church, once nearly empty, began to fill again, as people sought solace and strength in each other. The children of Milbrook, raised on stories of Hawthorne's winter, grew up wary but strong. Sarah and Mary Thornberry, now young women, became leaders in their own right. They organized gatherings for the town's youth, teaching them the skills of survival and the importance of compassion. They made it their mission to ensure that no one in Milbrook would ever feel as isolated or desperate as they had during that terrible winter. Rumors of Hawthorne's continued existence persisted. Travelers passing through the region spoke of a tall, pale-eyed man who appeared in remote towns during times of crisis, offering miraculous cures and survival advice. In each case, the pattern was the same: initial gratitude, followed by strange changes in behavior, and finally, a series of disappearances or unexplained deaths. Dr. Putnam, until his death, collected these accounts, convinced that Hawthorne or his philosophy was still at work in the world. Milbrook's ordeal became a lesson for the ages, that the greatest danger is not always the storm outside, but the darkness that can take root within. The town's survival was not just a matter of endurance, but of vigilance, courage, and the willingness to confront evil even when it wears the face of a savior. As the years rolled on, Milbrook's story became a cautionary tale, whispered far beyond the Green Mountains. The town's elders, those who had lived through the winter of Hawthorne, grew old and passed their memories to the next generation. The lessons were clear: never trust too easily, never let desperation blind you, and always question those who promise salvation at a price you cannot see. Sarah and Mary Thornberry, now mothers themselves, became the keepers of Milbrook's conscience. They taught their children to be wary of strangers, to value community, and to remember that survival is not worth the loss of one's soul. The sisters organized gatherings where the town's history was retold, not as a source of shame, but as a warning and a source of strength. They encouraged the children to ask questions, to challenge authority, and to look out for one another. Dr. Putnam's journals, after his passing, were entrusted to the Milbrook Historical Society. The society, recognizing the importance of the record, kept the journals under lock and key, sharing their contents only with those deemed trustworthy. The journals became a source of study for scholars and lawmen alike, who came from as far as Boston and New York to learn about the psychological manipulation and mass conditioning that had nearly destroyed the town. Jeremiah Prescott, in his later years, became a mentor to the young men of Milbrook. He taught them the value of hard work, honesty, and vigilance. He reminded them that evil often comes in the guise of good, and that the true test of a man is not how he acts in times of plenty, but how he stands firm when the world turns cold and hungry. Reverend Greenfield, though frail, continued to preach about the dangers of pride and the importance of humility. He spoke of the need for forgiveness, both for oneself and for others, and of the power of community to heal even the deepest wounds. His sermons, once filled with fire and brimstone, now offered comfort and hope to a town that had learned the hard way that faith must be tempered with wisdom. Rumors of Hawthorne's presence continued to surface. Stories circulated of a pale-eyed stranger appearing in distant towns, always during times of crisis, always offering help that came with a hidden cost. Some believed Hawthorne was still alive, sustained by the dark practices he had perfected. Others thought he was merely a legend, a symbol of the dangers that lurk when people abandon their principles in the name of survival. Milbrook endured, its people forever changed but unbroken. The town's ordeal became a lesson passed down through generations, that the greatest threat is not the storm outside, but the darkness that can grow within when fear and hunger take hold. The story of Samuel Hawthorne was no longer just a tale of horror, but a reminder that true strength lies in the courage to resist evil, even when it wears the face of a savior. By the late 1850s, Milbrook had become a place where memory and vigilance walked hand in hand. The town's children, now grown, carried the story of Samuel Hawthorne, like a talisman, something to ward off complacency and remind them of the thin line between civilization and savagery. The annual gatherings at the church became a tradition, where elders recounted the winter of 1847 and the lessons learned at such a terrible cost. Sarah and Mary Thornberry, respected matriarchs, continued to lead the community in both word and deed. They organized food drives for neighboring towns during harsh winters, refusing to let anyone in the region suffer the kind of desperation that had once made Milbrook vulnerable. Their children and grandchildren grew up hearing the story of Hawthorne not as a ghost tale, but as a warning. Never let hunger or fear make you forget who you are. The Milbrook Historical Society, now the guardian of Dr. Putnam's journals, and the town's collective memory, became a resource for other communities. Lawmen, doctors, and ministers from across New England visited to study the records, hoping to recognize the signs of psychological manipulation and cult-like conditioning before it could take root elsewhere. The journals were cited in early studies of mass hysteria and group psychology, and Milbrook's experience became a case study in how quickly a community could be turned against itself. Jeremiah Prescott, though slowed by age, remained a steady presence in the town. He taught the next generation to keep careful records, to question easy answers, and to trust their instincts when something felt wrong. He often said, "Evil doesn't always come with a warning. Sometimes it arrives with a smile and a helping hand." Reverend Greenfield's sermons, now delivered from a chair rather than the pulpit, focused on the power of redemption and the importance of never giving up on one's neighbors. He reminded the congregation that forgiveness was not the same as forgetting, and that the only way to truly heal was to face the past with honesty and courage. Rumors of Hawthorns continued. Existence still drifted in from the mountains. Hunters and trappers spoke of a tall, pale-eyed man seen in remote settlements. Always during the hardest winters, always offering help that seemed too good to be true. Some believed he was immortal, a wandering spirit doomed to repeat his cycle of salvation and destruction. Others insisted he was just a man, proof that the capacity for evil is never far from the surface. Milbrook, though forever marked by its ordeal, became a beacon of resilience. The town's story was shared in schools and churches, a reminder that the greatest threat to any community is not the storm outside, but the darkness that can grow within when people forget their shared humanity. As the Civil War loomed on the horizon, Milbrook's story took on new meaning for its people. The lessons of Samuel Hawthorne's winter were invoked whenever hardship threatened to divide the town. When food was scarce or tempers flared, elders reminded the young of what had happened when fear and hunger had made neighbors into strangers. The phrase "Remember Hawthorne" became a quiet warning, a way to pull back from the brink when desperation threatened to erode the bonds of trust. Sarah and Mary Thornberry, now grandmothers, watched over their families with a fierce protectiveness. They taught their grandchildren to be resourceful, to share what they had, and to never let pride or secrecy take root in their hearts. The sisters often walked together through the fields at dusk, recalling the days when the snow seemed endless and the world had shrunk to the size of a single, terrified community. They spoke of forgiveness, but also of vigilance, of the need to question those who offered easy answers in hard times. The Milbrook Historical Society continued to safeguard Dr. Putnam's journals, adding new entries as the years passed. The Society's members corresponded with scholars and lawmen across the country, sharing what they had learned about psychological manipulation and the dangers of charismatic leaders. The journals became a touchstone for those studying the darker corners of human nature, and Milbrook's experience was cited in lectures and sermons from Boston to Chicago. Jeremiah Prescott, though slowed by age and arthritis, remained a pillar of the community. He trained the next generation of merchants and record keepers, insisting that transparency and honesty were the best defenses against the kind of secrecy that had once allowed Hawthorne to thrive. Prescott's store became a gathering place for debate and discussion, a place where no question was off-limits and no rumor went unchallenged. Reverend Greenfield, now nearly blind, continued to preach about the importance of humility and the dangers of moral certainty. He warned that evil often comes disguised as necessity, and that the true test of a community is not how it endures hardship, but how it treats the most vulnerable in its midst. His words resonated with a congregation that had learned, through bitter experience, that survival is meaningless if it comes at the cost of one's soul. Rumors of Hawthorne's presence continued to surface, especially during the harshest winters. Stories circulated of a stranger appearing in remote settlements, offering miraculous cures and survival advice, only to vanish when the snow melted and the missing were counted. Some believed Hawthorne was still alive, a wandering spirit doomed to repeat his cycle of salvation and destruction. Others saw him as a symbol, a reminder that the line between savior and monster is always perilously thin. Milbrook endured, its people forever changed, but unbroken. The town's ordeal became a lesson passed down through generations, that the greatest threat is not the storm outside, but the darkness that can grow within when fear and hunger take hold. The story of Samuel Hawthorne was no longer just a tale of horror, but a reminder that true strength lies in the courage to resist evil, even when it wears the face of a savior. The decades after the Civil War brought new challenges to Milbrook, but the memory of Samuel Hawthorne's winter remained a guiding force. The town rebuilt itself, welcoming new families and adapting to the changing world. But it never forgot the lessons of vigilance and unity. The story of Hawthorne was now woven into the fabric of Milbrook's identity, retold at every harvest, festival, and in every classroom. A living warning against complacency and blind trust, Sarah, and Mary Thornberry, now among the oldest residents, became living legends. Their wisdom was sought by young mothers and town leaders alike. They taught that true community was built not just on shared hardship, but on shared responsibility. "We survived because we stood together," Sarah would say, "but we nearly lost ourselves because we stopped asking questions." The sisters made it their mission to ensure that no one in Milbrook would ever feel as isolated or desperate as they had during that terrible winter. The Milbrook Historical Society continued to expand its archives, collecting not only Dr. Putnam's journals, but also letters, diaries, and newspaper clippings from across New England. Scholars visited from distant cities to study the town's experience, and Milbrook's story became a case study in early psychology courses and law enforcement training. The society's members traveled to other towns, sharing what they had learned about the warning signs of manipulation and the importance of transparency in leadership. Jeremiah Prescott's descendants took over the general store, maintaining his tradition of meticulous record-keeping and open discussion. The store remained a hub for the community, a place where news was shared and decisions were made collectively. The Prescott family became known for their integrity, and their commitment to honesty helped to rebuild the trust that had once been shattered. Reverend Greenfield's legacy lived on in the church, where his successors preached sermons of humility, compassion, and vigilance. The congregation, once divided by fear and suspicion, found new strength in their shared history. The church became a place of healing, where the wounds of the past were acknowledged and the lessons of Hawthorne's winter were never forgotten. Rumors of Hawthorne's continued existence faded with time, but the fear he had inspired lingered. Occasionally, a traveler would arrive with tales of a pale-eyed stranger offering help in a distant town. But these stories were now met with skepticism and careful investigation. The people of Milbrook had learned to trust, but never blindly. As the 20th century dawned, Milbrook stood as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The town's ordeal had forged a community that valued both strength and compassion, that understood the dangers of isolation and the power of unity. The story of Samuel Hawthorne was no longer just a warning, it was a promise that no matter how dark the winter, the people of Milbrook would face it together, with open eyes and unyielding hearts. As the 20th century unfolded, story became a touchstone for generations facing new uncertainties. The town's elders, many of them direct descendants of those who had survived Hawthorne's winter, made it their mission to keep the memory alive. They organized annual gatherings at the church and the town square, where the story was retold, not as a tale of shame, but as a lesson in vigilance, resilience, and the enduring power of community. Sarah and Mary Thornberry, now frail but sharp-minded, were honored guests at these gatherings. They spoke less of the horrors they had witnessed and more of the strength that had carried them through. "We are not defined by what we endured," Mary would say, "but by how we chose to rebuild." Their words inspired a new generation to value honesty, to question authority, and to look out for the vulnerable among them. The Milbrook Historical Society, now a respected institution, continued to collect and preserve the town's history. Dr. Putnam's journals, once hidden away in fear, were now displayed in a glass case at the town library, available for scholars and townspeople alike. The society hosted lectures and workshops, inviting experts in psychology, history, and law enforcement to share their insights on the dangers of manipulation and the importance of community safeguards. The Prescott family, still running the general store, became known for their commitment to transparency and fairness. They encouraged open dialogue about the town's past, believing that only by facing the truth could Milbrook remain strong. The store's back room became a meeting place for town councils, youth groups, and anyone who needed a safe space to speak their mind. The church, too, evolved. Reverend Greenfield's successors continued his tradition of humility and compassion, focusing on the values that had helped the town survive its darkest days. The congregation supported outreach programs for neighboring communities, sharing Milbrook's story as a warning and a beacon of hope. Rumors of Hawthorne's legacy persisted, though now they were more myth than memory. Occasionally, a traveler would claim to have seen a pallid stranger in a distant town. But these stories were met with skepticism and careful inquiry. The people of Milbrook had learned to balance caution with kindness, never forgetting the lessons of the past. As the decades passed, Milbrook thrived. The town's ordeal became a source of unity, a reminder that, even in the face of unimaginable darkness, a community could endure, heal, and grow stronger. The story of Samuel Hawthorne was no longer just a tale of horror. It was a testament to the power of truth, the necessity of vigilance, and the unbreakable bonds of a people who refused to be broken. By the 1920s, Milbrook had become a symbol of resilience in the region. The town's story was taught in local schools, not as a ghost story, but as a lesson in the dangers of blind trust and the strength found in unity. The annual Remembrance at the church drew visitors from neighboring towns, and the Milbrook Historical Society's archives became a destination for researchers and journalists, seeking to understand how a small community had survived and learned from one of the darkest chapters in New England's history. Sarah and Mary Thornberry, now in their twilight years, were revered as living links to the past. They spent their days surrounded by grandchildren and great-grandchildren, passing on the lessons of Hawthorne's winter with gentle insistence. "Never let fear make you cruel," Sarah would say, her voice soft but firm. "And never let hunger make you forget your neighbor's name." Their family, once nearly destroyed by suspicion and manipulation, had become a model of generosity and compassion. The Prescott family continued to run the general store, its shelves now stocked with goods from across the state. The store remained a hub for news and debate, a place where no question was too uncomfortable and no memory too painful to discuss. The Prescotts encouraged the town's youth to read Dr. Putnam's journals, to understand the warning signs of psychological manipulation, and to recognize the importance of transparency in leadership. The church, under the guidance of Reverend Greenfield's successors, expanded its outreach, offering support to families in crisis and organizing food drives during harsh winters. The congregation welcomed newcomers with open arms, but always with a gentle reminder of the town's history. We are strong because we remember. We are safe because we care for each other. The Milbrook Historical Society, now housed in a new building near the town square, hosted regular lectures and exhibitions. Scholars from across the country came to study the town's experience, and Milbrook's story was cited in academic papers on group psychology, cult behavior, and the resilience of rural communities. The society's members traveled to other towns, sharing their knowledge and helping to establish similar organizations dedicated to preserving local history and promoting community vigilance. Rumors of Hawthorne's continued existence had faded into legend, but the fear he had inspired lingered. Occasionally, a traveler would arrive with tales of a pale-eyed stranger offering help in a distant village. But these stories were now met with careful investigation and a healthy dose of skepticism. The people of Milbrook had learned to trust, but never blindly. As the century marched on, Milbrook thrived. The town's ordeal had forged a community that valued both strength and compassion, that understood the dangers of isolation and the power of unity. The story of Samuel Hawthorne was no longer just a warning, it was a promise that no matter how dark the winter, the people of Milbrook would face it together, with open eyes and unyielding hearts. As the decades passed, Milbrook's story became woven into the larger fabric of American folklore. The town's annual Remembrance grew into a regional event, drawing visitors from across Vermont and beyond. School children recited the tale of Samuel Hawthorne, not as a mere legend, but as a living lesson in the dangers of desperation and the strength of community. The story was adapted into plays, radio dramas, and even early silent films. each retelling emphasizing the importance of vigilance, compassion, and the courage to question those who promise salvation at a hidden cost. Sarah and Mary Thornberry, now remembered in portraits and family stories, had left a legacy of leadership and kindness. Their descendants continued to serve as teachers, town officials, and volunteers, always guided by the principle that no one in Milbrook would ever be left to face hardship alone. The Thornberry home, once the site of so much fear and confusion, became a gathering place for celebrations and community meetings, a symbol of how a family and a town could reclaim its soul. The Prescott family's general store remained the heart of Milbrook's daily life. Generations of Prescotts kept a tradition of open books and honest dealings, ensuring that every resident felt seen and heard. The store's back room, once a place of secret meetings and whispered fears, was now used for town councils, youth groups, and the sharing of stories, both old and new. The Milbrook Historical Society, now a respected institution, continued to expand its archives. Dr. Putnam's journals, along with letters, diaries, and artifacts from the Hawthorne winter, were preserved for future generations. The society hosted visiting scholars, law enforcement officials, and students, all eager to learn from Milbrook's hard-won wisdom. The town's experience became a case study in psychology and ethics, cited in textbooks and university lectures, as an example of how ordinary people can resist extraordinary evil. The church, rebuilt and expanded, welcomed all who sought comfort or guidance. Reverend Greenfield's legacy of humility and compassion lived on in his successors, who preached the importance of forgiveness, self-reflection, and the need to protect the vulnerable. The congregation supported outreach programs for neighboring communities, sharing Milbrook's story as both a warning and a beacon of hope. Though rumors of Hawthorne's return had faded, the town never let down its guard. Newcomers were welcomed, but always with gentle questions and a reminder of the town's history. The people of Milbrook had learned that evil does not always announce itself with violence or malice. Sometimes, it arrives with a smile and a promise of help. As the 20th century progressed, Milbrook thrived. The town's ordeal had forged a community that valued both strength and compassion, that understood the dangers of isolation and the power of unity. The story of Samuel Hawthorne was no longer just a warning, it was a promise that no matter how dark the winter, the people of Milbrook would face it together, with open eyes and unyielding hearts. By the mid-20th century, Milbrook had become a model of rural resilience. The town's story was featured in history books and psychology journals, and its annual Remembrance was broadcast on local radio, drawing listeners from across New England. The lessons of Samuel Hawthorne's winter were now part of the region's collective memory, a reminder that the greatest threats often come not from outside, but from within. When fear and hunger are allowed to erode the bonds of trust, the Thornberry and Prescott families, still pillars of the community, continued to lead by example. Their descendants served as teachers, doctors, and town officials, always guided by the principle that no one should be left alone in times of need. The Thornberry home, once a place of terror, was now a community center, hosting everything from holiday feasts to town meetings. The Prescott General Store remained a hub of honest commerce and open conversation, its ledgers and records a testament to the town's commitment to transparency. The Milbrook Historical Society, now housed in a modern building near the town square, expanded its mission. It offered workshops on community vigilance, hosted traveling exhibits on cult psychology and groupthink, and partnered with universities to study the long-term effects of trauma and recovery. Dr. Putnam's journals, once hidden in fear, were now digitized and available to researchers around the world. The Society's members traveled to other towns, sharing Milbrook's story and helping to establish similar organizations, dedicated to preserving local history and promoting community safeguards. The church, rebuilt after a fire in the 1930s, continued to serve as a place of healing and reflection. Reverend Greenfield's successors preached sermons of humility, compassion, and vigilance, reminding the congregation that evil often comes disguised as necessity. The church's outreach programs supported families in crisis, and its doors were always open to those seeking comfort or guidance. Rumors of Hawthorne's legacy had faded into legend, but the town never forgot the lessons of the past. Newcomers were welcomed with warmth, but also with gentle questions and a reminder of Milbrook's history. The people had learned to trust, but never blindly, and to value the strength that comes from facing the truth, no matter how painful. As the decades passed, Milbrook thrived. The town's ordeal had forged a community that valued both strength and compassion, that understood the dangers of isolation and the power of unity. The story of Samuel Hawthorne was no longer just a warning, it was a promise that no matter how dark the winter, the people of Milbrook would face it together, with open eyes and unyielding hearts. As the 20th century drew to a close, Milbrook's legacy was secure. The town had become a symbol of what a community could endure and overcome when it refused to let fear or desperation dictate its future. The annual Remembrance, now a week-long festival, brought together families, scholars, and visitors from across the country. The story of Samuel Hawthorne was performed in plays, recounted in documentaries, and discussed in classrooms as a living lesson in the dangers of blind trust and the power of collective memory. The Thornberry and Prescott families, their roots now intertwined with those of countless other Milbrook residents, continued to serve as stewards of the town's history. The Thornberry home, preserved as a museum, welcomed school children and tourists alike. Its rooms filled with artifacts and photographs from the winter of 1847. The Prescott General Store, still family-run, remained a place where news was shared, debates were held, and every newcomer was greeted with both kindness and curiosity. The Milbrook Historical Society, now a nationally recognized institution, expanded its outreach. It partnered with universities and law enforcement agencies to develop training programs on cult prevention, crisis response, and the psychological effects of trauma. Dr. Putnam's journals, once a closely guarded secret, were now cited in academic papers and used as teaching tools in psychology and ethics courses. The Society's members traveled to conferences and workshops, sharing Milbrook's story and the lessons learned from its darkest days. The church, rebuilt and expanded, continued to serve as a place of healing and hope. Reverend Greenfield's legacy lived on in the sermons of his successors, who preached about the importance of humility, compassion, and vigilance. The congregation supported outreach programs for at-risk youth and families, ensuring that no one in Milbrook or the surrounding region would ever face hardship alone. Though the story of Samuel Hawthorne had faded into legend, its lessons remained fresh. The people of Milbrook had learned that evil does not always announce itself with violence or malice. Sometimes, it arrives with a smile and a promise of help. The town's experience became a case study in resilience, cited by psychologists, historians, and community leaders as an example of how ordinary people can resist extraordinary evil. As the new millennium dawned, Milbrook thrived. The town's ordeal had forged a community that valued both strength and compassion, that understood the dangers of isolation and the power of unity. The story of Samuel Hawthorne was no longer just a warning, it was a promise that no matter how dark the winter, the people of Milbrook would face it together, with open eyes and unyielding hearts. As the 21st century unfolded, Milbrook's story continued to echo far beyond the Green Mountains. The town, once nearly lost to darkness, had become a beacon for communities everywhere, seeking to understand the balance between vigilance and trust, tradition and change. The annual Remembrance was now live-streamed, drawing viewers from around the world. School children recited the tale of Samuel Hawthorne, not as a relic of the past, but as a living lesson in the dangers of desperation and the enduring strength of community. The Thornberry and Prescott families, now woven into the fabric of Milbrook's identity, continued to serve as guides and guardians. The Thornberry home, preserved as a museum, welcomed visitors eager to learn from the artifacts and journals that chronicled the town's ordeal. The Prescott General Store, still bustling with life, remained a place where every voice was heard and every story respected. The Milbrook Historical Society, now a leader in the field of community resilience, expanded its mission to include digital archives, educational outreach, and partnerships with organizations around the globe. Dr. Putnam's journals, once hidden in fear, were now available to anyone seeking to understand the psychology of survival, the dangers of charismatic manipulation, and the power of collective memory. The Society's members traveled widely, sharing Milbrook's story and helping other towns build their own traditions of remembrance and vigilance. The church, its steeple, visible for miles, continued to offer comfort and guidance. Reverend Greenfield's legacy lived on in the compassionate leadership of his successors, who preached that true faith is not blind, but questioning, not rigid, but resilient. The congregation's outreach programs supported families in crisis, welcomed newcomers, and ensured that no one in Milbrook would ever face hardship alone. Though the legend of Samuel Hawthorne had faded into myth, the lessons he left behind remained vital. The people of Milbrook had learned that evil can wear many faces, and that the line between savior and monster is often perilously thin. They understood that the greatest threat to any community is not the storm outside, but the darkness that can grow within when fear and hunger are allowed to rule. As the years passed, Milbrook thrived. The town's ordeal had forged a community that valued both strength and compassion, that understood the dangers of isolation and the power of unity. The story of Samuel Hawthorne was no longer just a warning, it was a promise that no matter how dark the winter, the people of Milbrook would face it together, with open eyes and unyielding hearts. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything about Samuel Hawthorne was truly revealed, or could there be more to his identity and the shadowy organization he served? Share your theories in the comments below. If this tale made you question how much we really know about the people around us, subscribe to Unseen Anthology, hit the notification bell, and share this story with someone who loves historical mysteries that blur the line between fact and fear. Join us next time as we uncover another chapter from the shadows of American history that authorities tried to bury forever.